everybody. I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for Literature and Coping Skills. I'm back with another segment. If you remember, in my last lecture, I talked about the psychology of fear. But before that, I started with the idea of taking you back to literary experience and the things that it does to us, and the idea of poetry and healing. So by now you might have gathered some important ideas about the association, the relationship between literary experience and our emotional responses, and literary experience and the power of healing. So in my last lecture, I focused on the psychology of fear, and I also talked about how fear has certain neurobiological aspects. I talked about the triggers that cause fear. I talked about how to manage fear and a variety of other things. So today I'm going to talk about the psychology of anxiety. As I told you in my last lecture that for the sake of convenience I have kept them separated, although to most fear and anxiety mean the same. They are not different, but we know that they have certain subtle differences, although they have a huge amount of similarities between them. So before I talk about the psychology of anxiety, let me quickly give you a recap of what I did in my last lecture. So I talked about what is fear. So we focused on the both sides of fear, the negative and the positive as well. So that must have helped us take a fresh look at the idea of fear. We looked at different forms of fear, starting with trepidation and moving towards the sharpest and most intense of all fear forms, terror. And then we focused on those brain areas that get activated for our emotional responses, emotional reactions, whenever we are faced with certain emotional stimulus, including amygdala. I also talked about various fear triggers that cause fear in us. And then I also talked about those three human responses to fear, SSDR, if you remember: freeze, flight, and fight, fear responses. And then I talked about the function of fear, how it performs a variety of functions, including trapping us within its spiral and then helping us adapt certain measures and develop certain skills with the help of which we can overcome the fear that has grown larger and contain it timely. And then I also talked about managing fear, how we can manage fear with the help of certain ideas, certain tricks, or certain strategies, how we can develop certain skills in us so that we can manage our fear well. So with that, I'll take you to the idea of anxiety. So that's how we come to the idea of psychology of anxiety. So today I'm going to talk about these important aspects of anxiety and try to establish a link between our psychological well-being and anxiety states. So we'll start with what is anxiety, then move to forms of anxiety, and then we'll come to anxiety and the brain and see how anxiety and brain functions are correlated, are closely associated. And we'll also go to anxiety types to see the different types of anxiety that we need to take care of so that we do not run into them. And then we come to anxiety triggers, the causes of our anxiety. And then finally, we'll know how to manage our anxiety with a few tricks. But before I talk about each of these ideas, let me tell you all that, like fear, Anxiety is also an inherent and integrated part of our existence. And that's one big reason why most people see such a great closeness between fear and anxiety. And that's how people treat anxiety and fear as synonymous. Apart from their subtle differences, fear and anxiety have a lot of similarities between them. So we need to understand that fear is qualified by an object, whereas anxiety is not. So fear is anxiety that is attached to a specific object, observable danger or threat, whereas anxiety is not characterized by any such object. So it floats in vacuum. It has no form, it has no object, it has no target. So it's important that we understand the difference, this particular subtle difference between fear and anxiety. I can cite an example to explain this further. Take, for example, the case of a golfer. So the golfer may experience fear and anxiety simultaneously. The golfer may experience fear as he or she moves towards the ball, picks the shot or prepares for the shot, and then finally takes the shot. So the golfer may be scared of the fear of failure. If you do not hit it properly, it might not go a long way. But at the same time, that fear will turn into anxiety the moment the golfer begins to think about how others are going to respond to his shot. What kind of responses others are going to show when the shot is taken. So this time the golfer will be overwhelmed by something that we call performance anxiety. So the golfer will be worried about how his or her performance is going to be, how his performance is going to be rated by the audience, by people around him. Similarly, I mean, it can happen to a dancer. So the dancer can fear breaking his or her leg while performing. So that can be a fear, an imagined fear. But at the same time, the dancer can be preoccupied by a sense of anxiety of how the performance will be rated. So again, a performance anxiety. We are going to face an interview. We will experience anxiety, and that anxiety will have no form. It will have no object. I may fear one particular expert on that panel, but my anxiety will not have any such object or any such figure. So this difference will help us understand the subtle differences between fear and anxiety, and that will help us understand anxiety better, and that will also help us manage our anxiety. So let's take a quick look at each of these components. Let's start with what is anxiety and take a look at what things make up anxiety. So this image probably lets you know, tells you how anxiety looks like, how you project yourself when you're overtaken by anxiety. You don't know what to do because you've lost contact with yourself, your executive brain has stopped functioning, and you are totally frozen. You don't know what to do. So that's the power of anxiety, because I told you, if you have developed fear for something, then you have a chance of overcoming that by taking care of the object of your fear, because fear is qualified by as an object. But anxiety doesn't have any object. So what are you going to do? How are you going to pick the object of your anxiety? How are you going to give a form, shape to your anxiety, to the source, to the object of your anxiety? So that's a very, very difficult task. So that's the reason why most people find it very difficult to cope with anxiety, while it is easier to cope with fear. So we all know anxiety is also a type of emotion that is characterized by feelings of tension. worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. The moment you experience anxiety, your blood pressure will go up, your heartbeat will go up, your heart will begin to race, pound. You can experience palpitation and a variety of other things. So, anxiety will make you experience it emotionally, psychologically, and physiologically as well. At the same time, will experience. If you're anxious, that means you are greatly nervous. Therefore, you are experiencing sweating, some kind of mild trembling, and a variety of other things. So, it will reflect on your psychological and your physiological state simultaneously. So, it seems to be experienced as an unpleasant inner state. As I've already told you, fear most often is projected outwardly. It's an external state. You're afraid of something that lies there, that is there. Maybe the rabbit, the barking dog down the street. Or you may be scared of the speeding car. You may be scared of the snake right in front of you. So most often it is externally projected. It's not an inner state if it's not imagined. But anxiety is always an unpleasant inner state. And when in anxiety we begin to anticipate some dreadful thing happening that is not predictable from our actual circumstances. So your circumstances may be very, very pleasing, may be very, very happy, jovial, cheerful. Still, you can experience anxiety because your anxiety has nothing to do with your environment or your actual circumstances. You might be in the company of your friends who are very happy, but you might simultaneously experience anxiety because it's an unpleasant inner state. So while being in the company of friends, you can still experience anxiety. So that's the power of anxiety. That's the strength of anxiety. Unless we come to terms with its power and strength, we'll not be able to overcome, we'll not be able to take care of anxiety. So anxiety includes feelings of uneasiness. That's exactly what I meant when I say that you may be in the company of your friend who are extremely happy, but you are uneasy. Even while being in the company of your friends, you can feel extremely uneasy and you do not know why it is so. You cannot give a reason for your feelings. So it also leads to distress, which is often associated with the apprehension of misfortune and danger. So you're always hounded by some kind of misfortune or danger. You do not have a form, you do not have the object right in front of you, but you are apprehensive of it. So it's your fight against an invisible enemy. So that's anxiety for you. When it is about fear, it's your fight against a visible enemy, an objectifiable enemy. So fighting with fear is comparatively easier than fighting with anxiety. But as I have already told you all that, we are evolutionarily designed to fight our way back into the safe mode. So we'll have to leave the survival mode. So anxiety will promptly push us into the survival mode, but we have to devise ways to fight our way back into the safe mode. So despite this overpowering and overwhelming power of anxiety, we still devise ways to overcome, to fight our way back and get rid of it. So we'll be taking a closer look at some of these ways soon. So anxiety is not inherently problematic like fear. So most people think that fear is a negative emotion. You can do this yourself. You can check with people around you. You ask them, I'm naming 2 emotions. You tell me which emotion would you like to have, would you like to experience, would you like to go with. So you tell them happiness, yes. Most of them would say yes. In fact, all of them will definitely say yes to happiness. But not all of them will say yes to fear. So we all want to avoid fear. We all want to escape fear. We all want to remain insulated from fear. But we have discovered that fear is not that negative as it has been painted to be. So fear can in fact help us protect ourselves, preserve ourselves, and then adopt adaptive measures to become more resilient and stronger. So fear has this wonderful positive side as well. Similarly, anxiety is also not inherently problematic. So it also has a positive side to it, and that's the reason why it always pays to be a little anxious, to experience anxiety. If you're not experiencing anxiety, that means you're not experiencing that particular feeling at all. For example, you have an interview the next day. If you're not experiencing nervousness and anxiety, that means you're not focused on it. You need to experience anxiety. So the moment you experience anxiety, you get a signal from yourself that there is something which is extremely disturbing and distressing, and you need to take care of it. And that's exactly when you begin to think about it, you begin to act upon it, and you find ways. But before you can strategize and find ways, you need to cultivate certain coping skills, so that with the help of those skills, you can devise these strategies. So anxiety is not inherently problematic. It is in fact the anticipation of a feared event. It's just the anticipation of a feared event. It can be an interview. So that interview, while you know, can give you a job, can make your life settled, it also brings with it the fearful stimulus. So most people treat it as a fearful event. Examination, most people treat it as a fearful event, although it's not there to scare you. Your interview is not there to scare you. They are there to give you something substantial. So therefore, it's important that you understand that these feared events are not that fearful as we paint them to be. So it's just the anticipation of a feared event. Therefore, it's not inherently problematic. It's the anticipation. So the problem lies in the anticipation, in the apprehension. So if we can take care of the anticipation or the apprehension element, that means we can take care of anxiety as well. We can take care of that fearful event as well. So that's the idea. So when it comes to the forms of anxiety, we can understand these various forms on the basis of these 3 things: duration, intensity, and frequency. When it comes to anxiety, we need to understand the duration, intensity, and frequency. So what is the duration of your anxiety, your anxious experience? What is your anxiety all about? Is it a prolonged experience? Are you able to overcome it, or does it leave you after a short period? For example, you just faced the interview and your anxiety is over. Is that the case? Or even when the interview is over, you'll experience the same kind of anxiety over a prolonged period. If that is the case, then there's some problem. Intensity of your anxiety. Is it anxiety positive? Is that anxiety going to help you adapt? Or is it extremely distressing, challenging? It's so distressing that you cannot manage it. You cannot contain or control it. So, is that the case? The intensity also needs to be measured. And finally, the frequency. How often are you visited by anxiety? Is it many often? As I told you, fear never leaves us, but anxiety should leave us. We cannot afford to be in a state of anxiety frequently, consistently. We are in a state of fear constantly, but we cannot afford to be in a state of anxiety constantly. So, is it extremely frequent? So, you can sit down to map your anxiety, the frequency of your anxiety. How often do you experience anxiety? Every now and then, every moment. If that's the case, there's some problem. You need to begin to think about it seriously. So, these are the three things that help us understand the forms of anxiety well: duration, intensity, and frequency. So, like fear, anxiety also has a positive side. It helps us, and we all know that. Anxiety and nervousness, they all help us. If I'm experiencing anxiety, that means I'm focused on that particular activity, that particular task. If I'm not experiencing any anxiety, either I'm absolutely confident about it or I do not care about it. So, the experience of anxiety is a natural phenomenon. It's a universal phenomenon. So, there is nothing wrong about experiencing anxiety. So, great performers experience anxiety before delivering each of their performances. So, there is nothing bad about it. So, that's the reason why there is a type of anxiety that we can call normal. It's normal anxiety. That means it's absolutely normal for each one of us to experience that type of anxiety, because that helps. So, this is an important aspect of this normal type of anxiety. So, this type of anxiety is a sensation that is experienced by virtually all human beings. So, you're not the only one who experiences anxiety. So, if you have developed this type of thought, so promptly drop that. You're not the only one to experience anxiety. In the same way as you're not the only one to experience fear. There are lots of people around this world who experience both fear and anxiety. So, you're not the only one, you're not the chosen one. So, the very idea, the very realization of this idea that anxiety is universal and it's a sensation that is experienced virtually by all human beings makes it easier for us to manage, because okay, people around me also experience anxiety. So, anxiety is not such a negative and such a disturbing or distressing emotion. So, that will help you develop some kind of confidence in you. And then that brings us to the idea of anxiety as a feeling of diffuse, unpleasant and vague apprehension. So, when you look at these three words that describe anxiety, they are descriptors of anxiety. The first is diffuse. It's so diffuse that we cannot give a form to it. It is objectless, formless. We cannot give a form to it. It's very diffuse, slippery. We cannot even manage it properly. Therefore, it's very important that we understand its diffuse nature. Then it's unpleasant. We all know it makes us uneasy or feel uneasy. It makes us feel distressed, and it's extremely vague. It's so vague because it's formless, it's objectless. So, this understanding is important. And if it's so, there's nothing bad about it. It's very diffuse, unpleasant, and vague. We all know that. At the same time, anxiety, like fear, also performs an adaptive function, because it serves to improve our functioning and well-being, our everyday functioning. If we are not anxious about things that we do, if I do not experience anxiety, that means I am not leading an authentic existence. Therefore, it's important for me to understand that anxiety is relevant, it's important to my well-being and my existence, because it is a signaler. It gives me signals about possible dangers, possible misfortunes. So, it serves to improve our functioning and well-being. So, if you can recall the interview example, it helps you serve. Okay, it serves you function well, do well in the interview. On the flip side of it, we have another type of anxiety which is not normal, at least through the lens of medical science or neuroscience. It's not normal, it's pathological. The moment we call it pathological, that means it comes under the scrutiny or the lens of medical science or neurobiology. It's pathological. Anxiety up to this particular level is fine, because it's very, very positive. It has adaptive functions, roles. But anything beyond this particular limit turns out to be pathological. So therefore, when anxiety becomes chronic and severe, chronic means the frequency increases, severe, intensity increases, duration increases, then it becomes pathological. That's the reason why I talked about duration, intensity, and frequency of anxiety. So it suddenly becomes pathological. That means anxiety has become a problem. It's become a mental challenge for you. It's not a positive emotion for you anymore. It has developed certain negative proportions. It has become pathological. So pathological anxiety is an exaggerated fear state, in which the hyperexcitability of fear circuits, you remember the fear circuits, amygdala, the hippocampus, hypothalamus, the medial prefrontal cortex. So the fear circuits that include the amygdala is expressed in increased behavioral responsibility to fearful stimuli. So it becomes exaggerated, and that increases behavioral responsibility to fearful stimuli. That means you experience a certain change in your behavior to the fearful stimuli. So you behave in manners that escape definition, that escape reason, understanding. So that's how anxiety certain turns out to be pathological if it is not contained, if it is not managed, if it's not regulated properly. So that takes us to the idea of anxiety in the brain. In the same way as we took a look at fear in the brain, let's take a look at anxiety and the brain. So the amygdala is the most important thing when it comes to emotional responses or emotional reactions. Amygdala does everything, along with the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. So it's amygdala that is the main actor. So anxiety fills the brain with stress hormones like cortisol. So if the cortisol level grows up, the executive brain will stop functioning properly. That means amygdala will also be affected by the stress hormones. So these stress hormones will lead to the aggravation of anxiety, increasing anxiety levels. So at the same time, anxiety also makes the brain hyperactive to threats. The threat may not be as big, but you'll suddenly begin to shout, scream, howl and growl in such a manner as if that's a huge threat. So there'll be a miscommunication between how you perceive the threat as and how you respond to that particular threat. So your anxiety will make your brain so hyperactive to threats that you'll not be able to distinguish smaller manageable threats from those bigger and unmanageable threats. So there'll be a huge gap between your understanding and your response. So anxiety, if it turns out to be pathological, will result in this. And then we all know anxiety will make it very hard for the executive brain to reason. Your executive brain will stop functioning. It will not be able to, find out or what to do. It will not be able to stop or send the right kind of signals to the creative brain. And anxiety, in turn, will train the brain to cling to negative memories only. So if anxiety turns out to be pathological, it will make you cling to negative memories. That means you lose touch with the positive. So it will gradually draw or drive you towards the negative, and the negative spiral is exactly where you'll find yourself trapped in, and then you'll gradually hit the bottom. You'll be enclosed within it. So therefore, it's important that we understand these neurobiological aspects associated with anxiety experiences. So a quick look at anxiety types. We all know that it rings a bell in the mind, a swirling bell in the mind, anxiety. So this is a very popular anxiety disorder, general anxiety disorder, GAD or GAD. So there's a panic disorder as well. That's a type of anxiety. The panic button is pressed every now and then. And then we have a social anxiety disorder, and that will prevent you from going out or becoming social. You're not social because you are scared of rejection. You'll feel a lot of anxiety while meeting people, meeting strangers, conversing with them, interacting with them, developing associations, bonding with them. So you'll lack all these abilities because of the social anxiety disorder. And then we come to post-traumatic stress disorder, or a severe kind of anxiety. And then the obsessive compulsive disorder, another severe kind of anxiety, starting with the everyday anxiety types like general anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder, and coming to panic disorder, and then the severe types, post-traumatic stress disorder and obsessive compulsive disorders. So these are some of the most popular anxiety types, and the most serious anxiety types as well. Apart from these anxiety types, there are lots of other anxiety types. For example, decision-making anxiety, relationship anxiety, and a variety of other types of anxiety. So the list is very, very long, but for the sake of convenience, I have picked only those anxiety types that are the most serious ones and the most frequent ones. So when we take a look at these anxiety types, let's start with the general anxiety disorder, GAD. So it is an excessive, unrealistic worry and tension with little or no reason. You are constantly experiencing anxiety, and whenever anybody asks you, why are you so anxious? What is the root of your anxiety? You'll not be able to tell. You'll not be able to give a reason because you don't know what it is. It's so unrealistic. Unrealistic worry. Your worries, your tensions have no basis, no logical foundations. So unrealistic. So that's the general anxiety disorder, and this is a kind of anxiety disorder that most of us in fact suffer from. Most often we develop these unrealistic worries and tensions, and we begin to experience anxiety. And this panic disorder, it's so sudden, intense fear. Since it's very, very sudden, it's very intense. The intensity level is suddenly up, it's very high. For example, right in front of you see a lion, or right in front of you you see a speeding car. So the panic disorder, the panic button. Now when you see a car in front of you, that's fear. You can easily overcome that. You can jump away from it, from its track, and then save yourself. But anxiety is something that is so unrealistic, that is so formless. It will not help you, but you experience panic constantly. It's panic disorder, as if something has happened, whereas it has not happened. Okay, so that brings us to the idea of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Whenever we are exposed to terrifying events or traumatic events, ordeals that causes some physical harm and psychological harm to us, that turns out into a post-traumatic stress disorder. Therefore, it's called post-traumatic, because there is a traumatic experience, and that traumatic experience leads to PTSD, a severe kind of anxiety state. And then OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. It is characterized by recurrent unwanted thoughts. Thoughts that are not wanted. For example, you're hale and hearty, you're very, very healthy, you still think that I may collapse, I may have a heart attack and collapse. So that's unrealistic, unwanted. But these things gradually become your obsessions. And then your behavior reflects these obsessions. So those are compulsive reflections, behaviors. So therefore, OCD is a very severe kind of anxiety disorder. And then another very common type of anxiety disorder is social anxiety disorder, SAD. So it's an overwhelming worry and self-consciousness about everyday social situations. So you're ready to go to your office, you suddenly experience anxiety. How will my colleagues respond to my shirt today? How will they greet me? Are they going to greet me? So many unrealistic things. You have not reached that place, but you are already hounded by so many unrealistic thoughts. So social anxiety disorder. Then quickly, anxiety triggers. So these are some of the anxiety triggers. Health problems, actual real health problems lead to a lot of anxiety. If I have a health problem, if I know I have a health problem, I'll definitely experience a great deal of anxiety involving my health problems. Then relationship problems. If my relationships are not going great, then we'll definitely experience a lot of anxiety. So our relationship problems, starting with our family relationships, our office relationships, our work relationships, our social relationships, all types of relationships. If they have problems in them, that will lead to anxiety. And then stress, we all know that stress and anxiety are generally viewed together. So stress, it can emanate or emerge from work, burden, or ambition, target, task, a variety of things. So the moment you have stress, that means cortisol is active, and then that will lead to anxiety, the blocking of the functioning of the executive brain, and it will lead to anxiety. Conflict at work or home. So if you're passing through certain conflicts, maybe some family conflicts or office conflicts, anxiety is something that you are bound to experience. And then unpredictable, uncertain world events like a pandemic. We did not have any idea about the COVID-19 pandemic before either January or February 2020. So it suddenly happened. It was so unpredictable. It abruptly happened, suddenly happened, and it made our world so uncertain that we all began to experience anxiety. We all are passing through anxiety brought about by this pandemic, even today. So then a major emotional shock following a stressful or traumatic event. So if you have experienced an emotional shock following a stressful or traumatic event, you'll experience anxiety. So that's PTSD basically. So these are some of the most important anxiety triggers that we need to understand so that we can take care of each of these anxiety triggers well. They're bound to happen, these anxiety triggers, but we can do things to contain them, manage them. So that brings us to the idea of managing anxiety. So how well we can manage anxiety. So this diagram tells us how we need to be aware of the vicious cycle of anxiety. This is the vicious cycle of anxiety. So anxiety leads to increased sensing or scanning for danger, physical symptoms intensify, then attention narrows and shifts to self. So when that happens, as I have already told you, we humans are designed in a manner to avoid. So escape or avoid, that's a flight instinct, the avoidance syndrome. So we'll definitely promptly try to avoid that particular anxiety. And we do so because we know it will give us a short-term relief. At least we'll be able to overcome that anxiety, although for a short-term period we'll do so. But that particular relief will not be a long-term relief, and that will increase in physical symptoms, more worries, loss of confidence, and increased use of safety behaviors. That means every time we are faced with anxiety, we'll try to avoid escape. So that will lead to increased use of safety behaviors, and that will not be in the great interest of our psychological well-being. We must develop ways to manage anxiety, different strategies to take care of anxiety, different skills to be able to come face to face with anxiety. So how can we do that? So it's all like the art of puppetry, in which people know how to control each of their moves. So that's exactly what we can learn from puppetry, so that we can tie strings to our fingers so that we can contain these anxiety experiences. So we need to check our thought patterns. Has it developed a regular anxiety pattern? If that is the case, then we need to be careful about it. So checking your thought pattern periodically is going to help. The second is we can take small acts of bravery. We may not be warriors, but once we begin to put in small acts of bravery, those small acts of bravery will certainly make us a warrior in time to come. So we know that we have to fight. And how do we fight without being brave? So small acts of bravery will definitely help us overcome anxiety. For example, you're going to face an interview board or panel tomorrow. You'll have to be a little brave. You'll have to tell yourself that they're not going to kill me. They're going to ask me a few questions. All I have to do is to conquer those questions. Once I do that, there'll be no fear, there'll be no anxiety. So this small act of bravery will help you. And then you need to write down your thoughts. If you can do that, you will help yourself. So journaling is a wonderful idea. So that can help us overcome anxiety. So writing down my thoughts. How am I feeling now? What's causing that particular feeling? These are some of the tricks that we can do in order to contain or manage anxiety. And then finally, we can prefer to stay in the present moment. I told you that anxiety, in fact, brings us very close to our negative memories. So we constantly bring those negative memories back, and that spoils our present moment. When that happens, we'll lose touch, contact with the present. And that way, we'll lose contact with ourselves. So being in the present time is the key to overcoming anxiety. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. I hope you have liked the things that I talked about. When we combine these two lectures, fear and anxiety, that will make us understand the ideas associated with these two concepts very, very well. So thank you for joining me.